call to order the Wednesday, June 26, 2019 meeting of the Land Management Committee to order. And we'll just run around the table here and make sure we know who everybody is. We'll start with Dr. Zimmerman.
Bob Zimmerman, City of Moorhead.
Mary Sherling, Cass County Commission.
Eric Dodds, A2S.
Kevin Campbell, Clay County Commission.
Bruce Grubb, City of Fargo. Nathan Borbum, City of Fargo.
And Jason's just going to sit in the audience. Okay. Then we have a quorum. You have...
Jenny Mojo, Clay County Commission.
Oh, thank you, Jenny. Is anybody else on the line? Okay, welcome, Jenny. So you have in front of you the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? If not, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second? Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Item number 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Take a motion to approve those, or corrections, changes to the motion, to the minutes.
Move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes of May 22nd, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. And the property acquisition status report, item B, which are pages 9 through 17. Thank you for labeling these. These look great, by the way. I like that.
That was
Welcome.
Diana's good work. As you note in your packet here, the acquisition status report dated as of last week. Usual format. I just maybe would point out on page 10 the overall map that shows the status of parcel acquisitions. One thing I would just point out is up on the north end of the channel, there's more green this time. That's good news. There's also, as you go down south along the channel, there's more blue. Last month, many of those blue squares were sort of that tannish color. Blue means that we've completed the appraisal and we're now in negotiations with those property owners. So we're making progress. I would also just point out for reference, tomorrow the Cass County Joint Board is meeting and we have about another 20 appraisals ready for them to approve. And after they approve them, then the offers go to those property owners. And so after tomorrow, that'll be something like 40 plus appraisals that have been approved in the last month. So quite a bit of effort's been put into getting those appraisals reviewed and ready to make offers. And that's a key part of the process, and hopefully those offers then turn into purchase agreements.
And how would you say this process is going? Landowners' perspective.
Yeah, I think it's going well, but I know the process takes time, and that can be frustrating for people especially when they want to move quickly, and the process takes time to get into the queue of the appraiser. The appraisal takes some time. We have to wait for the board meetings and do the reviews, and every step just takes a bit of time, and so that unfortunately is kind of frustrating when it takes longer than people hope for. But other than that, I think property owners, I guess the feedback that I'm hearing is that they have some questions. We've got good teams in place to help answer those questions. There was probably a time years ago when people felt like maybe the project wasn't going to happen. I think we've overcome that, and generally people are accepting, maybe begrudgingly accepting that the project is happening, and they're just trying to get their questions answered and then negotiate in good faith to try to get the best deal that they can. So. The rest of the report, I guess I didn't really have any intention to share anything specific, but you can see the status indications. I guess it's all kind of summarized on the overall map on page 10. But if you have any questions or comments on that, certainly be happy to try to answer those.
Any questions for Eric? Okay, thank you. Then let's move on to temporary construction easements for the channel. That's item C, pages 19.
I think it's actually page 18, it looks.
Excuse me, 18.
Yep, page 18, yep. So in your packet here, there's a little one-page summary about temporary construction easements, and at the bottom of that is a recommendation. So for a bit of context here, I'll kind of summarize this paper. Currently, to date, for the diversion channel, we have been working to acquire property based on the indicative design that was developed several years ago, in large part before the advent of P3 for this project. And that indicative design included a certain width for the channel, and it included a buffer area on both sides for temporary construction of the channel. As we've been thinking more and more about, how do we, do we really need to acquire those temporary construction easements is the basic question. And some of that question got raised when we realized we had purchased some temporary construction easements several years ago when we first got started. And we purchased those for a 5-year period. And that 5-year period is not expiring today, but it will be before we expect construction to be completed. And so knowing that we may have some temporary construction easements that expire, and knowing that the P3 developers are going to be responsible for the final design as well as construction of the channel, the question came up of, should we really be buying these temporary construction easements, or would it be better if we left that to the P3 developer for them to decide if they truly in fact needed the temporary construction easements, or if they were able to complete the project within the fee title area. And in many cases, contractors are accustomed and capable of getting their own temporary work areas that they might need for the project. And so we've had quite a bit of staff and legal discussion about the pros and cons of this. At the bottom of the paper here, you can see that we're recommending to this committee that we approve the plan to continue acquiring the remaining fee title lands for the channel based on the indicative design, but forego purchasing any additional temporary construction easements. And if this committee approves that, then we would give this direction to the Cass County Water Resource District, as they're the acquiring entity for those lands, and we'll make sure that our appraisers and land agents are negotiating to only buy the fee title instead of the temporary construction. We do think that this should be viewed favorably by property owners. These temporary construction easements are areas where there's construction traffic driving on top of a farm field that we intend to turn back into a farm field. And many of you have been involved with construction. That's always a sticky point of, well, it's more compacted than I thought it was going to be, and it used to drain this way and now it doesn't drain that way. And all sorts of issues that become a challenge for the property owner as well as a challenge for the acquiring entity, us and the contractor. And so there's perhaps a lot of benefits of going this route. And in our experience, the property owners generally seem more comfortable working directly with a contractor on those issues than having to be working through an intermediary as the property or the acquiring entity. So open for discussion, but we're hoping that this board might be, or this committee might be comfortable making that recommendation.
Great. I guess I would just ask Mr. Shockley, I saw he walked in. Do you think this makes any difference to your P3 contractors?
Thank you, Commissioner Sherling, members of the Land Management Committee. We've had a lot of extensive discussions internally about this issue, and there's really two thoughts that have come out of the engineering team. Number one, that there's a feeling that some contractors may be able to work within the existing right-of-way without the need for additional temporary easements, given the size of the right-of-way and the working conditions. And the other is that there may be efficiencies that could be gained by just having the P3 contractor obtain their own temporary construction easements. So general consensus has been this is a workable solution, and probably is actually better from a cost standpoint. Specifically with respect to our temporary construction easements, they can only last a period of 5 years, and so potentially we could be in a circumstance where we're needing to renew a temporary construction easement with a year or two of construction left. So overall, it's it's better for the project, and I think it fits well within the P3 model, where they can best govern their risk of how they want to work within the right of way. Hopefully
Great,
that
thank you.
answers the question. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions for either Eric or John, or discussion or motion to recommend to the full board that we adopt this policy?
I guess procedurally, I don't know if, John, maybe you can help with this as well. It's my understanding that this committee can make this decision within the.
Goes right to the CAS board.
And
Right
if
to the
this
task
committee
board,
makes this
okay.
sort of policy decision about what lands to acquire, then it would go to the joint board. But, John, is that?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes.
Madam Chair, one last question, maybe for John, Eric. The right-of-way will be based on the indicative design, and in the P3, did the proposers have any latitude to move off that indicative design if there was a savings, or,
So
you know the question I'm asking?
it's a great question. There has been an extensive amount of research and discussion around that particular topic. They can move within the existing right-of-way. So if there's, small bends, or, they could narrow up the channel under bridges, they are certainly permitted to undertake that within the P3 documents. Moving the alignment outside of the right-of-way that was identified in the NEPA documentation would present significant challenges in the environmental review process. So we have indicated that they need to work within the established right-of-way that was approved through the NEPA documentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or I'd entertain a motion.
I'll motion that we approve moving forward with the policy of no longer acquiring TCs for the channel.
Thank you. Is there a
Second.
second? Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. And motion carries. Thank you. Item 6, upstream structure mitigation flexibility approach, pages 19.
So this is the document that we had worked on in coordination with the Corps for discussions with the Buffalo Red Watershed District and the Minnesota DNR. This document has been supplied to the Minnesota DNR for their review and consideration on whether or not it is compliant with their permit condition number 22, or whether or not it is incompliant, and they would be willing to issue a modification of their permit condition, or whether or not it is incompliant and never will be compliant. But the basic premise here is that we're trying to decide exactly and determine exactly how we need to mitigate existing structures in the upstream mitigation area, particularly on the fringes where there's less water depth, as well as restrictions for future development in those same areas. And so this has been developed, again, in coordination with the Corps. A lot of our local technical team here has developed this. And, the Buffalo Red Group did have some input and weighed in on this approach here. And I believe it was shared with the DNR last week. So eventually, we will also be sharing this with the North Dakota permitting entities and having some discussions with the North Dakota permitting entities about this flexibility approach. Really, the ultimate goal here is to give property owners more flexibility if they choose and want to stay on the fringes of the impact area. And one of the key criteria that we're pointing out is their home and any insurable structure needs to be elevated above the with project 100-year elevation plus a foot, which is generally the requirement anyplace else in the country. I think Fargo and Moorhead both are a little bit more restrictive than that, Fargo in particular. And so this is kind of trying to piggyback on that same condition for the upstream area. And then if the project does have a chance for any additional impacts above and beyond the 100-year, then we would propose that we could either compensate for those risks, which, trying to value that could be a complex appraisal assignment, but nonetheless, we could compensate for that risk. Or we could provide some protection that's not a certified protection, but nonetheless protection for events between the 100-year and the 500 or PMF level. And so this is something that the DNR has right now. I think they're reviewing it. We did have one meeting with the DNR maybe 2-3 weeks ago now, 2.5 weeks ago, and went through this in concept, not this paper, but at least the discussion, and they seemed willing and open to reviewing such a concept, and so it was kind of put together in response to their willingness. So I guess the other thing I would point out is a couple months ago at this committee, we talked about the development restrictions, and our initial interpretation from the DNR's permit condition was that any new development needed to be above the PMF. And as we've dissected this a bit further, we're feeling like there's a bit less restriction that should be allowed in the upstream, in portions of the upstream area. And so this paper is marked draft still, but it, if we can continue to work with the permit agencies, we think future development would not need to be held to such a high restriction in the upstream area. So I don't know, Bob, Nathan, you guys have been involved in this. Mary, I know you were involved with submitting to the DNR. I guess wanted to make sure this committee was aware, and happy to answer any questions, I guess.
So just to be clear, the only one here in North Dakota is the Christine one?
Yeah, so these were just 4 examples that we had pulled out with the goal of showing the DNR and the Buffalo Red Group some example properties. If this committee or perhaps the Office of State Engineer in North Dakota is interested in similar examples, we could find similar examples for North Dakota properties. There are, I'd say, maybe a dozen residential structure sites in Minnesota, and in North Dakota there's 4 times that. And so there's a lot more potential candidate sites in North Dakota.
How many of those are in Richland County, would you say?
I think there's 2 residential structures that are impacted, that are mandatory buyouts in Richland County. We've already purchased those. And there are another half a dozen or so that are above the 100-year that would fall into this flexibility category.
So if this was adopted, then we would not need any more structures in Richland County, as long as we took care of Christine?
To be clear, our initial, and our whenever we approach a property owner, if their structures are impacted by the project, our first offer would be to do a buyout. Some people will want to take that option because they have a guaranteed buyer. In other situations, those property owners will want to stay. And so I'm hesitant to say that we wouldn't need to do more buyouts in Richland County because the property owners might prefer that. Mm-hmm. And this is really aimed at giving them the flexibility.
Eric, Commissioner Sherling, I want to comment too, on our trip to visit with the Minnesota DNR on this, I think we were asking for clarification on that condition 22. And, from a project standpoint, there's, the flexibility in areas where we're certain that property owners could take some other method or approach to having flood protection and stay there. That's ultimately our goal. I think we just want to be clear that I agree with you. The very first thing, everybody who is impacted has their first option, if they so choose, is the buyout. But if there are other measures, and I think the DNR was, from what I gathered from that conversation, their floodplain person fully kind of understood some of those areas and where you can flood-proof and still meet the height regulations. those types of things, we're hoping we can be flexible. I think this is a good thing and a good approach for us to take. Having said that, until we finally get confirmation or something from the DNR, condition 22 is the way they read it.
Right, and so, I mean, frankly, we had some of these questions ourselves as to how exactly does permit condition 22 apply out in the field? And, you know, I guess frankly, the Buffalo Red sort of pushed the issue and encouraged us to figure this out, and so I appreciate that, and, you know, I'm hoping that the DNR is going to be receptive to this approach. We'll have to continue some discussions with them. I'm a little bit concerned with, you know, how responsive they might be willing to be, given the events of the last 48 hours or whatever, so, so we'll see. But
Well, finally, you know, I really appreciate the fact that the DNR took the time to listen to us. And, you know, I think the message that they got and that they gave back to us is that they will review it all, and you know, hopefully we can continue that dialogue with them to, there's a little bit of uncertainty into what their condition says. And, you know, we want some flexibility, and I think that's where we're going to try to go. I'll leave it at that.
I don't know how soon we'll have any answers at, you know,
Right.
where everything is standing right now.
yeah,
I mean, they're being sued by the Buffalo Red, basically,
Right.
so it's a little
on the
difficult spot to be in.
On the North Dakota side, we are intending to have some of these same conversations with the Office of State Engineer in the coming weeks, and so, you know, while there's been a lot of focus on the Minnesota side, and, you know, that's, I think, been productive, we're hoping to continue that productive discussion on the North Dakota side.
And just for my, maybe ask this question before, I'm sure I have, but how many in Wilkin County then would have an option compared to the total number?
If I recall right, I should have those numbers at my fingertips, but I don't. It's a small handful of residential structures in Wilkin County, maybe half a dozen or so, and there's a few of them in Wolverton that, you know, we've had some conversations about maybe a community-type project, ring levy or something for Wolverton, so there's just a small handful outside of Wolverton that, and only 2 or 3 in Wolverton. So.
Do we need to take any action on this, or is this just?
No, I don't think there's any action. I guess what I would suggest, though, is if you're willing to allow us to continue working with the permitting agencies to try to, you know, vet this out into finer detail, ultimately we'll come back to this committee and probably the full board with an updated mitigation plan that will adopt all of this information, and then we'd have a, right now we're operating on version 4 of the mitigation plan, which we know is outdated, but until this sort of gets settled down, we haven't been putting too much effort on updating the mitigation plan, but ultimately this would get rolled into a version 5 of that mitigation plan, ask for future approval on.
One thing that became very apparent Monday evening at the Buffalo Red meeting is that there were members in the audience that really had no clue how they were being affected by the project and what their mitigation options might be. They haven't reached out to us that I'm aware of, and they're working off old information. So I don't know if, you know, I mean, I know people have gotten letters, but it's pretty hard to try to educate people on what their options are if they're not cooperative. But I don't know if you had any other thought, Eric, on how to let people know, because honestly, the work that was done that we were proposing for the Buffalo Red permit would have been a huge benefit to folks down in Wilkin and Richland County. And, you know, that got denied. So it's really frustrating for myself, I'm sure for everyone that's working on lands. So,
Yeah, I guess maybe just a couple comments. So, you know, we sent out that mass mailing back in, I think it was February timeframe. And in that letter, we told property owners that we were working on the final review of the hydraulic model, and we were working on some of these, you know, clarifications on permit conditions. And in the subsequent one-on-one meetings that we have had with certain property owners and some township meetings, we've been trying to continue carrying that message that we're waiting on really these kind of two things, the Clomer review and approval, and then this permit, you know, condition clarifications. And I guess my expectation has been that when we get those two things clarified, we would send an additional notification, an additional letter with, you know, more information out to the property owners. I'm hoping that we can do that as soon as possible, but until then, I don't know that we've got a ton new to tell them because the Clomer isn't finally approved and this is still being reviewed by the permit agencies. And so I suppose we could tell them we're still working on it and maybe there's value in that. I'm not sure. Otherwise, we've had a number of one-on-ones, and when we're able to explain that in person, people seem to be appreciative of that info. But if you guys think another mailing or some other approach would be valuable, I think we're, you know, eager to do.
no, I guess I just encourage folks that feel they're being negatively impacted to please reach out to, you know, to the lands, to Eric here, and, you know, find out exactly how their individual property is going to be impacted and what the options might be so that they're informed rather than just standing up a meeting and shouting. Yeah. I think that would be in their best interest to get some good information instead of just hearsay. Okay, then moving right along to the City of Christine ring levy concept.
A couple months ago, Jason Benson, Robert Wilson, Lyndon, myself, maybe one or two others met with the City of Christine at one of their council meetings and talked about the project impacts in Christine. And at that meeting, we had a concept for a ring levy that was developed several years ago. And we asked the city if they would like us to update that concept. They had, you know, a handful of questions about, you know, they didn't want to be boxed in. They didn't know if they needed much room for growth. They were concerned about drainage, you know, through town and around town. And so ultimately they said, yeah, it would probably be valuable to have an updated concept of a ring levy. And then they asked us to be prepared to come back to their meeting in July. And so I wanted this group to just be aware that that concept has been developed. You see it attached to your packet. Again, this has been developed by the technical group from Houston Water Team, and we had some brief discussion about it at a sort of internal technical group meeting. And our plan is to go share this with the City of Christine at their meeting in July and see if you know, this is something that they are interested in and, you know, want to continue to advance or not. There is some efforts being put on, you know, sort of a cost estimate for this. It's likely that the ring levy would be more expensive than just doing the individual properties that are impacted in Christine. But this is one of those things that I think we had committed to years ago, and if the community was interested in a ring levy, I think that commitment was something that you know, we wanted to stand by. So wanted this group to be aware of it, and I don't think there's any action here today. This is still draft and subject to additional vetting, of course. But
So a couple of months ago or more, we were out in Christine and had that public, you know, meeting that was kind of an update, but it really ended up, you know, the idea of the meeting was to let people know what the land process is and how Eric's group works through appraisals and the whole procedure. But it ended up being a lot more questions for a hydrology engineer, which we unfortunately didn't have one. It was pointed out, had a roads and bridges engineer with us. who claims he knows a lot about water. I don't know where he went, but, but anyway, we're going to have another meeting to address those concerns. Have we gotten that out then? And
Yeah.
you feel like,
So since that time, there was a number of representatives, that was actually a township meeting, if I recall right. And since that time, there were a few representatives from Eagle Township as well as reps from Walcott Township that we have had meetings with. We brought the right hydraulic engineers to those small group meetings and had some real good discussions, shared some information, asked them specifically if they felt they needed to have another township meeting, and they felt like they appreciated the info and they would bring it back themselves to the township. And so I think there's been some good, sort of dialogue that's come out of that Christine meeting. The Christine meeting itself wasn't a whole lot of fun, but I think, information was shared, and again, we've had some good additional outreach stemming from that. The other thing I would just note is that when we do get the Clomer approval, or part of the Clomer approval process is a community notification step. These guys know more about it than I do, but basically that provides another sort of mandatory, but an opportunity for us to reach out to all of the area jurisdictions, townships, cities, counties, et cetera. And so I think we should be thinking about using those opportunities for another touch point with property owners to address hydraulic issues and, drainage and everything else.
so when does that happen in the whole scheme of things?
Oh, it all depends on how the timing of FEMA's review is going along. We actually just had a call with FEMA's review team today, so they are actively reviewing the Clomer submittal. Hopefully August, but we don't have any sort of timeline yet on that.
Sorry, we got off a little bit from land management, but they all kind of tie together. Then on to item number 8, cultural mitigation update.
The Corps' team, a small group of their team, was out in the field doing some, initial inspections of the cultural mitigation sites. I think they found what they were expecting to find, is kind of how I would generalize it. And they're intending to come back on site the week after the 4th with a bigger group and sort of, get their, hands dirty, doing more of their efforts, so.
Doing more exploration,
Okay.
seeing the extents of what the full mitigation is going to require.
So I know this is, oftentimes the question comes up is, has this been through the city has a Indian tribal?
Native American Commission.
Thank you.
Yep.
And there was a presentation there last month, and it sounded like that went well, and
Yep.
good coordination there.
Yep, and the Corps will continue to coordinate with organizations like that as this mitigation proceeds.
Great, thank you. Any questions on that? Then I don't see anyone here from the Cass Joint Water Resource District. Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I just mentioned earlier that we've got another batch of about 20 appraisals that'll go for the board for approval tomorrow. There's a couple other acquisitions that are scheduled for approval tomorrow. So seems to be going well.
So I have a question. Over the years, I think, policies have, been set on acquisitions, and they've probably been refined a bit, going forward. And of course, now we're really rolling with them. So I assume that everybody has gotten into a pretty good rhythm of how it all works. And this leads into item number 9 or 10. How are we going to make sure that our policies are reflective both in Minnesota and North Dakota, with item number 10 being the Minnesota? We want to make sure that everybody's, the rules are a little different, but by and large, we should be treating everybody the same, I would hope.
Yeah, I guess I would maybe just start by a couple things. The joint powers agreement that has now been approved by Moorhead and Clay County and is scheduled for the Diversion Authority's concurrence tomorrow lays out sort of the process that is supposed to be used by the Minnesota entity, and it's very much matching what is being done in North Dakota. And so that JPA is, a good foundation. I would also say that in the conversations we've had with those Minnesota members, we've walked through the process that's being used in North Dakota. We've walked through probably more procedural type basis and, given some sprinkling of some policy type issues. But as we get into the nuts and bolts of things, they're probably going to have, obviously there's a desire to, be absolutely uniform across the entire project, but, as you pointed out, there are two different states and, there are different rules that we'll need to abide by. And so, I guess I think that's probably something that, we're going to have to just continue to monitor. I know, like in today's packet, we asked about this temporary construction easements, which doesn't really apply to the Minnesota side because this is just on the channel. But those types of issues, we try to bring here for certain action, and then we'll have to carry that back. I guess, right or wrong, I sort of feel as you've asked us to help manage that process, and so I guess I carry that burden.
So will we have the same staff, that being the land agents, the attorneys, because I would think that would lend some consistency.
Yeah, I guess my understanding is the Minnesota JPA provides them the opportunity to hire their own staff if they choose for this purpose, but my understanding is you would agree with that consistency.
Yeah, we would want to stay consistent, and we would look to use the same appraisal, organizations and everything, as long as they're licensed to do so in Minnesota. So the whole intent is really to follow the exact same process as the Cass County Joint Water Resource District, with the caveat where the only time something might change would be based on the different laws appropriate to Minnesota. Other than that, I think everything else has been designed for acquisitions to follow the pattern of what you've done on the North Dakota side.
So do we have to put out a new RFP then?
When we did the RFP for appraisal work, we made sure that our respondents indicated if they were licensed in both North Dakota and Minnesota. And so in Minnesota, they don't have a requirement to do an RFP. And we sort of had that foresight as we put it out. And so I think there's, the goal would be that you could just enter into a professional services contract with those same appraisal groups if desired.
The way and maybe Mr. Shockley can correct me if I'm wrong too, but the way that our system is set up is that, the funding mechanism still is channeled through the Diversion Authority. So the sources of paying for land acquisitions in Minnesota will come from one of two places. It'll come from the Diversion Authority or it'll come directly from the state of Minnesota. John, is that?
That is correct, and in conversations I've had with Dr. Zimmerman, we drafted the JPA so that they could be an entity that would enter into agreements with the state of Minnesota requesting cost reimbursement. You'll recall the state has already appropriated about $4 million, and there's a DNR program available. And assuming that the Diversion Authority consents tomorrow to the creation of JPA, one of the first tasks will be initiating that cost share agreement with the state of Minnesota.
So if you needed to use legal services, for example, would you, in Minnesota, do you have to use your state's attorney or the city attorney? You'd use the same group that we've engaged in the past? Okay, great. Anything else you want to add on the Minnesota? When do you guys get started?
Well, our goal is to call our organizational meeting in July, and I think kind of looking for Mr. Shockley and to help set that up. And I requested at that point in time we should probably have Mr. Shockley and Mr. Dodds both there to get that organizational deal going. And then we'll ask Dr. Zimmerman to probably be there either at that one or shortly thereafter to start the process on the grant applications and those things that we'll want from Minnesota. So it'll get in full swing in July, provided there's approval tomorrow.
Okay. Then on to item number 11, other business. Is there anything anybody else has? Jenny, do you have anything?
Not right now, thank you.
Okay, thank you for joining us.
The only thing I might add is, I think you probably know Colonel Calkins is retiring from the Corps, and in recognition of his service, we put together a book similar to, we've done this for Darrell and Mayor Williams and others, I think, that have sort of retired from the project. And so there's a spot here, the last few pages, for people to sign. We've been trying to carry this around and encourage people to sign. So if you haven't yet, he's going to be here tomorrow, so the time is ticking for you to sign, and we encourage you to do so.
Yes, well, I'll let them, I'm going to stick around for an hour.
Okay.
So if somebody else wants to sign now, I can do it during.
Okay.
Any other business? I motion to adjourn then, please.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you. We are adjourned.